All right, Larry Krueger here from the Pig in a Pickle Krug Show with a little 49er video on a beautiful Sunday, brought to you by Pig in a Pickle, the best barbecue in all of Northern California. Check them out. They're in Emeryville. They're in Corte Madera. They're open 7 days a week from 11 a.m. till 8 p.m. or until they run out, and they do run out. So get there early, get some brisket chili. Tell them Krug sent you. Also, the Krug Show brought to you by Habas Law, and check out the new Habas Law commercials with Macklin Celebrini, with Omar and Tarek Habas. They've got a new series of TV commercials that are really, really cool. And thanks to Habas Law, 1-800-INJURED, habaslaw.com on the web. Thanks to Habas Law for being a proud sponsor of the Krug Show as well. All right, let's get to the story of the day. And I don't even know if it is a real story, but it is interesting. And it's juicy, and that is Jeremy Fowler, ESPN NFL reporter, says that teams are calling the Eagles about their defensive tackle, Jaylen Carter. And Carter is an incredible player, and this is a very interesting story on a lot of fronts. Okay, so let's talk about it. Now, first of all, the question is, the first question is, are the Eagles shopping Jaylen Carter, or are teams just calling about Jaylen Carter after seeing that the Eagles extended Jordan Davis and just figuring the Eagles don't want to spend the money, that much money, $60 million potentially on two defensive tackles? Are teams being proactive and calling Philly, or is Howie Roseman letting it be known around the league that Jaylen Carter is available and he's going to get traded and we're going to take the best offer we get, and if you're interested, throw an offer our way? Now, the report says that the 49ers are one of the teams showing interest in Jaylen Carter. Green Bay, Chicago, the Niners, the Seahawks, and the Raiders, plus a number of other teams have called to kind of kick tires on what it would cost to get Jaylen Carter. Let's talk about it. So the Niners are one of the teams showing interest in Jaylen Carter. Now, some people are wondering if that's legit. Are the Niners being mentioned to try to get Seattle to pay a better price, or is Seattle being used, to get the Niners to pay a bigger price? That was the first thing I thought when I saw that. Interesting, though. I mean, immediately, this is a very interesting story. Is Philly interested in dumping Jaylen Carter? Should the Niners make a trade for Jaylen Carter? And then, of course, the question is, what would it take? So let's talk a little bit about this for a second. And it's interesting on a lot of fronts, right? Why? Because Jaylen Carter's awesome. He's 24. He's one of the best young defensive tackles in the sport. He's super talented. His agent's Drew Rosenhaus. He's got 2 more years of contract, where he's under contract for 2 more years. So he's not a free agent for 2 years. So anybody who's trading for him gets him for 26 and 27. So, and then the first question you would ask is, why would the Eagles deal away Carter? Well, okay, let's look at it first from their perspective. They just paid Jordan Davis, a ton of money. They just gave Jordan Davis a 3-year, $78 million deal with $26 million guaranteed. So they've paid Jordan Davis. So that's one thing. They've also going to probably pay Quinyon Mitchell $30 million plus. They're going to wind up paying Cooper DeJean over $25 million. A.J. Brown makes over $30 million. And then Carter is in the last year of his rookie contract. They could, and he's going to want a $30 million a year extension, which then the other question is, can the Niners afford Jaylen Carter at this point? Lynch says that the Niners' number one need is defensive front, and they were dead last in sacks. And they've got, the other thing, and I made the comment a couple weeks ago, they lack some nasty on their defensive front. Jaylen Carter, trading for Jaylen Carter would be like trading for Charles Haley. This guy, Dante Whitner has kind of challenged the Niners. Hey, they keep going for all these guys from Harvard and Yale and, Stanford and Iowa. And, he's like, why don't you go get some badass dudes? And this is exactly what he's talking about. Jaylen Carter is a badass dude. All right, he's had problems. He spit on Dak Prescott. He had an incident where he was speeding that resulted in someone dying. You could say he runs a little hot. The Eagles may be tiring of him. That he was thought to be a character concern coming out of Georgia. This guy's an awesome player. He was awesome at Georgia. He wore 88. He was one of the best interior pass rushers that we've seen in years, and he's come into the NFL, and he's a difference maker, man. This guy's 24. He's a force. This guy's a game changer. This guy has to be doubled on every snap. This is the kind of nasty that I'm talking about when I say the Niners need some nasty on their front line. Nothing against Bosa or Collins or West or any of these guys, but they just need some nasty up front. And, I was suggesting maybe Zion Young from Missouri, but man, Jaylen Carter is exactly what Dante Whitner's talking about. Are you going to swim in these waters where you're going to go after the best players in football, even if they run a little hot? Or are you going to steer clear of these guys? John Lynch, it's interesting because John Lynch I'm sure, he played with some really great guys, I'm sure, at Stanford, but he played with some pretty rough characters at Tampa Bay. I mean, Warren Sapp wasn't exactly, a choir boy. So it's not like Lynch has never played with any real rough dudes where it's not like he's not going to take a look at guys who are kind of rough. But this would be, the Niners taking a roll of the dice on somebody who they might be able to get at a reasonable price because of character concerns and cap concerns. And he may not be a fit in Philadelphia. Now, would Philly deal him to the Niners? Man, if I was Philly, I wouldn't. But, maybe Howie, that's the other, we'll get into what it potentially could be in a trade. But, how many teams are willing to give you a number one pick? If I were the 49ers, if you think about it, you're the Niners, your number one stated goal is to improve your defensive front and your pass rush any way possible. And here's Jaylen Carter, who maybe you could get him for your first round pick. We'll talk about the compensation, but I would imagine it's either going to take Nick Bosa or that first round pick or both to get this deal done with Philadelphia. You're talking about a 24-year-old awesome pass rusher. Now, you are talking about a guy who's had some shoulder injuries. You are talking about a guy who has had, might be a pain in the ass. And Philly may be dying to get rid of him. Who knows? Maybe the price tag's lower than we think. But when you look at Philly's structure, they can't pay Jordan Davis and pay Jaylen Carter. You're not going to pay two defensive tackles north of $60 million in a cap sport. So it probably does make sense to move him now. He's in the last year of his rookie deal, and Jeremy Fowler says teams are calling on him. Now, Easton Butler, who's just a person on Twitter, a Packers media guy, he said that 5 teams have called the Eagles about Carter, and he named Green Bay, Chicago, the Niners, the Seahawks, and the Raiders. Let's go through those for a second, because to me, Green Bay's got no first-round picks, in 26 or 27. So I think Green Bay, unless Green Bay wants to move Devontae Wyatt, I know Howie loves the Georgia players. Maybe Green Bay moving Devontae Wyatt and second-round picks would get it done for Jaylen Carter. I don't know what Green Bay's offer would be, but I saw that Devontae Wyatt could be a guy they would move off of. And, that's an interesting idea. But other than that, Green Bay doesn't have first-round picks for the next couple of years. So they seemingly would not be a great fit. As far as the other guys, Chicago's got Montez Sweat. That would be an awful lot of money on the edge. The Niners, if they didn't trade Nick Bosa, that would be an awful lot of money devoted to the defensive line. Chicago does have the number one, or the Raiders do have the number one picks that they just got from the Ravens. Do they want to turn around and take those number one picks that they got in the Crosby deal and flip them, to Philadelphia in a deal for Jaylen Carter? But of course, the team that you look at and say, wait, what? And that's Seattle. And Seattle, has a lot of cap room. The world is their oyster. They're thinking of how they can keep their thing going, and loading up on the defensive side of the ball with a great player like Carter, who's nasty. I mean, John Schneider has never been afraid to take on guys who are character risks. He's the guy who drafted Frank Clark in the second round when other teams didn't have him on their board or had him, buried into the 6th or 7th round. Seattle took him in the second. So, he's gambled before. They took Malik McDowell and gambled and rolled the dice, and it did not come up well, right? He was a bust. He had an ATV accident, and it didn't go well. So Seattle is a team. Could you imagine if all of a sudden you've got Byron Murphy and you've got Leonard Williams, and somehow you've got, Jaylen Carter all on the same line? I mean, from the 49er perspective, I don't know that I want to see that. I may want to be in this deal flow just so I don't see Jaylen Carter wind up in the division at age 24. So he has had a troubled past. He did spit on Dak Prescott. He did have that speeding situation. He is going to be looking for an extension. He also has had some shoulder injuries, between the character concerns, the shoulder problems, the money that's going to be coming his way. It seems unlikely. But once again, let's think about it from Philly's perspective for a second, because it takes two to tango on this thing. If you're Philadelphia, they may want Nick Bosa. Now, before you sit there and go, what? Nick Bosa's just torn his ACL for the 3rd time and makes a lot of money. And you look at Philadelphia right now, at defensive tackle, they have Jordan Davis, who they just signed to an extension. They have Moro Ajomo, who can play inside or outside. He's 295 pounds. They just drafted Ty Robinson out of Nebraska. They like him. They have Byron Young, the former Alabama player who was with the Raiders. So they have good depth at defensive tackle. That's 4 defensive tackles going into free agency and the draft, even without Carter. So they have good defensive tackles. And then you look at Philadelphia on the defensive line at the end spot. Well, yeah, they have Jalix Hunt and they have Nolan Smith, but Jalen Phillips is a free agent. Azeez Ojulari, free agent. Brandon Graham, free agent. Ogbo Okoronkwo, free agent. Josh Uche, free agent. I mean, they have 5 defensive ends that 3 days from now could all walk away in free agency, and they have nothing. They're pretty naked at defensive end. So Howie may be looking at their depth chart and just going, you know what? We have defensive tackles. We need to we can't pay everybody. Why don't we move one of our defensive tackles for a defensive end? So, if it's about money, then Jaylen Carter for Bosa probably doesn't make sense. I asked Chase Sr., who covers the Eagles, what he thought it would take. He said he thought 2 number ones. I thought 2 number ones seems a little high because you got to factor in the shoulder injury, and you also got to factor in, Jaylen Carter is not necessarily a Boy Scout, and Philly easily could be tired of him. And there could be some reports that we just don't know about with things off the field with him. I mean, he is a little bit of a character risk, and this is more of a character. This would be a big roll of the dice for the Niners if they give up anything significant. Now, I would imagine, first blush, the Niners and their fans would much rather have Nick Bosa and Jaylen Carter. And so maybe the Niners could make their deal around Renardo Green. Could you make a deal where, how about this? How about a Renardo Green, Ricky Pearsall first-round pick, and you get Jaylen Carter and A.J. Brown? Something like that where you really turn over, a number of pieces there. Otherwise, I mean, Renardo Green and your first-round pick. Renardo was a second, and maybe, Philly ultimately winds up trying to get a first and a second. Maybe they would take Renardo Green. You know, they've had problems on the corner. Renardo's a good corner. He's young. He's talented. He plays well. You know, Renardo Green in this year's first. I mean, you look at Jaylen Carter and you look at the guys that they might be able to get at the 27th pick in the first round, and none of them are Jaylen Carter. I mean, there's not a Jaylen Carter sitting there. And if there is, you know, it's a projection, and, you know, do you trust the 49ers at this point to make the right call there? You know, they've missed on a number of these picks. You may want to go for the sure thing. You know, and it's been done before. Les Snead, you know, right now has a much different job security situation than he had years ago. Years ago, though, he hadn't won the Super Bowl, and his first-round picks had been hit and miss and hit and miss, and he'd gotten close, but he'd never won the Super Bowl. And then suddenly he said, you know what, screw them picks, and then brought in Stafford and Ramsey, and, you know, they won the Super Bowl, and now, you know, he's been able to, with the Super Bowl on his resume, take a deep breath and really kind of, you know, build things now the second time around in whatever fashion he wants. But the first time there was tremendous pressure. Well, I bring that up because I think there's tremendous pressure on Lynch and Shanahan right now to get that ring and to get over the top. And, you know, they may have to dance with the devil a little bit. You may have to go with some rough guys. You know, football's a rough sport played by some rough guys. You know, Whitner, I think, made a compelling point that you can't just have a room full of choir boys. You got to have some tough guys, especially on your defensive line. And this guy is that kind of guy. Now, what's it going to take to get him? I don't want to move Nick Bosa, but I know Philly would want Nick Bosa. But maybe not. Maybe they're going to re-sign Jalen Phillips and they want the picks. You know, maybe would you give 2 number 1s for Jaylen Carter? That seems a little rich. But I'd give a first-round pick this year and Renardo Green, who was a pretty high pick in his own right, and I think he's the equivalent of like a second or third round pick right now as a player. Philly has a need at the corner. I think that makes sense. So very interesting stuff for sure. You know, Jaylen Carter to go after Jaylen Carter at this point would be a little bit of a risk on character, but if you could somehow, you know, when you got to have a line where you got to double somebody, and with Bosa you had that. They tried to get that second player in Hargrave. You know, they want that second player. They know Bosa commands doubles outside. They want that interior player that commands doubles. It's a harder thing to do because guys who command double teams typically do not become available. Here's a situation where Jaylen Carter is available and he commands consistent double teams. So there's some glitches, you know, character-wise. But you know what? I think this is the kind of player that would absolutely make them a better football team. I don't want to move Nick Bosa, as I said, but if I could get it done for a first in Renardo Green, I'd be interested. If I could get it done for, you know, a future pick, I'd be interested in that as well. So very interesting stuff. Will Jaylen Carter get moved? And the big question is Philly shopping him, or are teams just calling about him? And I think Philly's shopping him. I think Philly's absolutely